So part 2 of COGEH, I'm going to give you a high-level overview of everything else that's in the COGEH documentation. So if you were doing a direct comparison between COGEH and PRMS, COGEH has a wider scope than PRMS. It talks about a bunch of concepts that are outside of basic oil and gas evaluation. So the rest of the COGEH presentation today is going to talk everything else that's in the 3 volumes of COGEH to give you an understanding what else is included. So we've gone through the reserves and resource definitions, which is one of the key sections of COGEH, but this is going to cover all the other sections of all the other volumes from a high level. I'm not going to be going into as much detail as I did this morning. We'll talk a little bit about qualifications of evaluators and auditors, what's necessary to be classified as a qualified reserves evaluator or auditor, business practices for managing reserves and resources, so that'll give you a little bit of insight as to what COGEH defines for companies as best practices for managing reserves and resources. Talk about evaluation procedures. There's some very specific guidance in COGEH as to how you should evaluate oil and gas assets. And again, this is going to be a high-level overview. There will be, on the 3rd day, we'll go into a lot of detail on how you would go through an evaluation. Talk a little bit about reserves other than ROTR guidance, which is that new section that came out in 2014 to address unconventional resources. And then I'll quickly overview everything else that's in the COGEH volume. So again, we're talking about the Canadian Oil and Gas Evaluation Handbook and specific reference to ROTR that's been added recently. So the Canadian Oil and Gas Evaluation Handbook has been released in 3 volumes. The first volume came out in 2002 and was subsequently updated in 2007 when the second volume came out, or shortly after the second volume came out. Volume 1 is reserves definitions and practices and procedures. So Volume 1 is a high-level overview of most COGEH offers. It's basically the full scope of COGEH, and then Volume 2 and Volume 3 sort of expand within that scope. They give you more detail. So Volume 2 is detailed guidelines for the estimation and classification of oil and gas reserves and resources. This is where it's going to lay out exactly what you should do for an evaluation. It's going to give you some more information on the definitions that we went through. It's going to give you more specific examples as to how you should classify and categorize volumes. It also includes reserves other than reserves. That's what got added into Volume 2 in 2014. And then Volume 3 has detailed, there's 3 parts to Volume 3, and they address very different issues that came up after the first edition of COGEH was issued. So detailed guidelines for the estimation and classification of CBM reserves. So we talked a little bit about CBM. There was quite a bit of CBM in Western Canada, especially in the early 2000s when gas prices were very high. So it was a hot spot, and COGEH came out with some very specific guidelines to evaluating coal bed methane. Reserves recognition for international properties. So one of the other things that they realized after they issued the first volume is that COGEH was relatively specifically tailored to Canadian assets, as the title would suggest. So they did come out and said, well, if you want to use COGEH in other jurisdictions, here's a few pitfalls or a few things you should look out for when you're adapting COGEH standards to other jurisdictions. And then detailed guidelines for estimation and classification of bitumen and SAGD. So a lot of the original guidelines in COGEH were designed for conventional assets, and we have a lot of bitumen and steam-assisted gravity drainage. So SAGD is just a thermal process for extracting bitumen. And because there's so much of it, that bitumen actually dominates the resources in Canada in terms of the total barrels of resource in Canada. It's heavily dominated by bitumen. So because so much of our resource base is tied up in one product, they came out with specific guidance for bitumen and SAGD, which was necessary to deal with the different recovery processes. So getting into the qualifications of evaluators and auditors. In Alberta and Canada, we have professional engineering and geoscience organizations that have certain standards for ethics and morals and conduct. Within COGEH, it says that a qualified reserves evaluator or auditor should be part of one of these organizations as a safeguard for their professional conduct. So a qualified reserve evaluator is a registered professional, so that's in one of these organizations that I just mentioned. Good standing and license to practice anywhere geology or geophysics, with a minimum of 5 years of practical experience in petroleum engineering, geology, or geophysics. with at least 3 of those years, recent 3 years in evaluations. So that's what's required to be a qualified reserves evaluator. 3 years in evaluations and 5 years total in the industry. Qualified reserves auditor, because auditing is a higher level process and requires more in-depth knowledge of the assets looking at and how to evaluate assets. The guidelines are a little bit more stringent. You still have to be a good standing member in one of the professional organizations. On top of that, you need minimum 10 years of practical experience and 5 years in evaluations. So getting into business practices. So these guidelines talk about what public and private oil and gas companies can do to manage their reserves and resources more effectively or more efficiently. COGEH, it's mandated that reserves and audits be conducted by qualified reserves evaluators and auditors, as just talked about. COGEH and the SPEE, so the Society of Petroleum Evaluation Engineers, they strongly support independent reserves evaluation. So one of the mandates and one of the safeguards that they recommend is to have a third party evaluating or auditing your internal reserves to ensure you have less bias in your estimates. It defines independent, basically no direct or indirect interest in the company, any of its properties or any of its securities. It's defined in more detail, in significant detail in a certain section in COGEH. In order to ensure that these standards are being met, anytime you complete an evaluation and you create a report for it, your report has to include certificates that detail the qualifications of the people who conducted the evaluation. And it also has to declare whether they are independent evaluators or not. It's not actually mandated that you have to have independent evaluators. It's recommended, not mandated. All that is mandated is that you have to say whether the people who did the evaluation were independent or not. So they just have to declare their status. It talks a little bit about reporting practice and consistency, what you should put out there when you do what your evaluation report should include. So you have to include a reserves reconciliation comparing the current reporting year with at least the previous reporting year. You have to include what product prices and costs you're using, and the conversion ratios. About 10 or 15 years ago, it's not so much of an issue anymore, but there were a number of different BOE conversions being used in industry. Most of North America is now using a 6-to-1 MCF to barrel ratio. But either way, you have to disclose which ratio you're using if you're disclosing BOE. The other component that they require you to include in an evaluation report in Canada, this is fairly unique to Canada, is an engagement letter detailing the terms that, this is for independent contractors and independent consultants that do qualified reserves reports, they have to include the engagement letter that details the terms of the contract or the terms of their engagement with the company. And that's to make sure that the unbiased independent relationship is intact. So you have to talk about the scope of your engagement, how the data was transferred back and forth, how the compensation was set up to make sure it's not tied to the volumes that you put in your report, etc., etc. COGEH has a bunch of sample letters. There's going to be a number of sections that we talk about where COGEH provides essentially a template form for engagement letters, representation letters, a whole bunch of different templates are included in COGEH. In terms of the evaluation data, one of the mandates for an independent evaluator is to cross-check or verify data that's been provided by companies, by clients, by third parties to confirm reasonableness and completeness. In Canadian evaluations, most of it is pretty straightforward. We actually have a lot of data in the public domain, so all the production data, pressure data, some cost data. There's quite a bit of data. It makes it very easy to verify data that a company has sent over. In other jurisdictions, it can be a little more complicated, and it really comes down to experience and knowledge in a given area of the world or jurisdiction or type of play to confirm whether the data being provided is likely reasonable. In order to ensure from the company side that what they're sending over is comprehensive and accurate, COGEH also requires that you have the independent evaluator have the company sign a representation letter. So someone on the board or someone on the executive, a company will have to sign a letter that says, we've sent you all the data, it's all accurate, it's all there, and we haven't withheld any information, and everything we've provided to you is basically in accordance with COGEH guidelines. Again, COGEH provides a sample letter for the representation letter, and so that's included in every single evaluation that gets disclosed on the Canadian Stock Exchange. At the back of the report, you'll see a rep letter from the company, and you will see an engagement letter between the company and the consulting firm. The other discussion that's in COGEH is the concept of reserves committees. So in public companies, board of directors, as part of due diligence, will often establish a reserve committee of independent directors to review the results of the evaluation at the end of the year. These are generally people who are qualified in evaluations. COGEH doesn't mandate any of this because this is all best practices on the corporate side. It's not necessarily in the realm of evaluators, but COGEH recommends that you have at least one qualified evaluator or auditor on the reserves committee. Their job is to help select the independent reserves committee, help review the internal practices for evaluation procedures within the company, and help review the results of the annual evaluation or the evaluation being done. It's a good safeguard to make sure, it's a good way for the board to make sure that there's not anything shady or under going on with the reserves process. So the next few slides are talking about whole sections of COGEH, and what I put on slides is simply the table of contents for each section. So I just want to talk a little bit about what's in each section to give you an idea of what's included in COGEH, because it's very comprehensive if you actually follow COGEH. So section 7 is evaluation procedures. So this is how you should evaluate oil and gas assets. It talks about reserves estimation in general, production forecasts, product prices, interests, CapEx and OpEx. It has a specific section on Canadian income tax, cash flow analysis, and reserves evaluation reconciliation. So pretty much all of this is what I'm going to be going through on day 3. This is sort of what goes into a discounted cash flow evaluation for oil and gas assets. It has volume 1, which is what this is talking about, this is probably 20 or 30 pages, so it has basically a couple of paragraphs on each of these sections. It's fairly high level. Volume 2, which is the detailed guidelines, came out well after COGEH, goes into a lot more detail. So there's 2 sections in Volume 2 specific to estimation and evaluation of reserves. And again, these are completely tailored around reserves. They're not for contingent, they are applicable to contingent resources and prospective resources in some areas like CapEx, OpEx, and how you should be evaluating certain portions. But the guidelines were designed around reserves. So section 6 in volume 2 talks in much more detail about analogies, volumetrics, material balance, production decline, reservoir simulation, EOR, and integration of reserves. So again, we'll be going through a lot of this in the detailed course, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it today. Analogy methods under COGEH, analogy, and for a reservoir to be analogous, your subject reservoir that you're trying to evaluate, the parameters of the subject reservoir have to be as good or better in aggregate as the analogy you're trying to apply. So analogy is all about finding the appropriate reservoir somewhere else that has more data that you can apply to your subject reservoir. Volumetric methods is taking a look at, it starts with basically the rock volume of the reservoir, integrates pore volume and fluid distributions, and gives you an overall OGIP or OIP, an original gas in place or an original oil in place for the whole reservoir or the whole section of the reservoir that you're looking at, and then applies recovery factors. Material balance is all about fluid withdrawals and how pressure reacts when you withdraw fluids from the reservoir. They can be very simple in a homogeneous high porosity gas reservoir that just has gas drive. They can be very complex if you have a lot of different drive mechanisms within your fluid system. So there's material balance can either be simple and very accurate, or it can be complex and quite often very inaccurate. Production decline, that's where you probably spend 90% of evaluations. is forecasting production. That's wells that are on production, wells that have pressure and production data. Reservoir simulation, COGEH basically says it's very good in theory, it can be a very useful tool, but be careful with reservoir simulation because there's a lot of idealized inputs. It talks a little bit about EOR projects and how to deal with incremental recoveries, and it talks about acceleration versus income reserves, which are two concepts that we spend a reasonable amount of time dealing with on EOR evaluations, I should say. And then section 7, so it goes into quite a bit of detail, validation and reconciliation of reserves. So it talks about what to look for in reserves evaluations to make sure that the definitions are being applied correctly and the results are reasonable. Reconciliations are essentially a report card for how the evaluations have been done. Major revisions, one way or another, can indicate problems with the process. So COGEH spends some time talking about how reconciliations would work. We've already gone through what should happen with 1P, 2P, 3P volumes. It spends a little more time detailing that. And it also talks about exactly what needs to be shown in a reconciliation. So it breaks down changes in reserves to about 6 or 7 key categories, from everything from prices and economics to technical revisions to infills and extensions. So it gives pretty detailed guidance on how to reconcile your reserves evaluations year over year. Okay, resources other than reserves. I've talked about this a couple of times. The previous COGEH guidance was heavily reserves related because contingent prospective resources were not disclosed very often in North America. There wasn't a lot of emphasis put on them in the guidance. Basically, starting in the late 2000s, getting close to 2010, multi-stage hydraulic fracs in North America took off, unlocked a massive resource in oil shales and gas shales, and it basically shifted the production landscape in North America. So what happened was we went from being basically a heavily conventional producing nation or nations in probably the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then by the 90s and into the 2000s, we started to shift more and more into the unconventional realm. And that really stepwise changed in about 2010 with multi-stage hydraulic fracs. So the evaluators decided that they needed to update the guidance to more accurately represent the evaluations for shale plays especially. And so ROTR was brought into circulation in 2014, and it provides detailed guidance and classification on contingent resources, because contingent resources started to be a much larger piece of a company's value proposition to stakeholders. So it was no longer that they could capture all the value of their land holdings in reserves, because contingent resources in conventional reservoirs can be heavily discounted from a value perspective. Usually if you have a conventional reservoir, there's not a lot of additional value in contingent resources. But as soon as you have an unconventional reservoir that you know is contiguous over a very large span of land, you know it's going to be hydrocarbon bearing, you know you're going to get gas out of a gas shale, then all of a sudden there's not nearly as much difference between a contingent resource location and a reserves location. And so as soon as producers started identifying this and understanding that the two volumes are much closer in value to a stakeholder or a lender or an investor, they put a lot more emphasis on disclosing contingent resource volumes to show the size of their asset. So in response to that, COGEH came out with some very detailed guidance on how to appropriately evaluate, classify, and disclose resources other than reserves. So just very quick, what's inside ROTR, general requirements for classification of resources. A lot of that is what we went through in the definitions. It talks about petroleum initially in place, again, similar to what we went through this morning. It talks a lot more about projects than the original COGEH did. PRMS has always been very project related, but COGEH kind of skipped over projects. ROTR really brought that back into focus. Then it talks about contingent resources, discovered unrecoverable petroleum in place, prospective resources, and aggregation of resource estimates. So again, COGEH Volume 2, Section 2, it's about 60 or 70 pages of very detailed guidance on how to classify contingent prospective resources. And we have the definitions that we went through this morning, and it's a lot of what's in ROTR. So what else is in COGEH? There's a section on time value of money and profitability indicators. So this talks about how to do discounted cash flow analysis, talks about the calculation of MPVs, talks about how to select discount rates and what discount rates are generally disclosed and why. Talks about profitability indicators that companies and banks and financiers and lenders generally use and why they use them and how they're calculated. And then it talks about what cash flow forecasts are used for. So this gives you an idea of methods to use to come up with net present values after the volumes have been evaluated and the production has been forecasted and the costs applied. There's a specific section on uncertainty in oil and gas reserves. This is really talking about statistics, and it gets into deterministic versus probabilistic methods, why they're used, how they're used. From a very high level, like I said earlier, the vast majority of evaluations use some sort of deterministic approach. Very few evaluations that have a reasonable amount of data will use a probabilistic approach. Probabilistic approaches are really, when you're looking at prospective resources, when you're looking at undiscovered accumulations, you really don't have a choice other than to use a probabilistic approach. Whereas as soon as you have a known accumulation and you have a decent amount of data, you can start to use deterministic methods. So deterministic methods make up the lion's share of what you'll see in evaluations. Reserves aggregation is another interesting concept. Basically, when we apply the confidence levels we talked about, when you're talking about approved, probable, possible estimate, and you're talking about P10, P50, P90, and even the deterministic, the qualitative descriptions of proof, probable, and possible, the high degree of certainty, those generally get applied on a well-by-well basis, on an entity-by-entity basis. Sometimes they get applied to groups of wells, sometimes they get applied to a whole field at once. Generally speaking, it's usually done on a well-by-well basis. And what happens is when you apply a very high certainty estimate to a whole bunch of different entities, and then you sum them all up arithmetically, you end up with a even higher degree of certainty in aggregate. So the problem is, you might start with P90 estimates on all your wells, but once you've arithmetically summed all your well forecasts up, you'll end up with a P99 instead of a P90. And so there's a lot to understand in aggregating reserves and resources and the best way to do it. And there's differences between probabilistic and deterministic again, and how you should aggregate. So COGEH gives you guidance, and so does PRMS, on how to aggregate reserves appropriately. Evaluation of undeveloped lands. This is a fairly short section. It talks about when you have mineral rights and a land base that has nothing on it, no prospects or offsetting production or anything like that. There's a section in COGEH that talks about how you would evaluate that, and it talks about a couple different methods of evaluation. And it has a section on content evaluation. So this is fairly detailed. It sort of lays out everything that needs to be included in an evaluation report from start to finish. It talks a little bit about there should be a higher level of disclosure for major properties in an evaluation. So the 80-20 rule, where 80% of your value is usually tied up in percent assets, is very true in almost all oil and gas applications. So when we're doing evaluations, there's usually, if a company has 100 properties, there's usually only 20 properties that actually matter. And there's a lot in COGEH that caters to that says, okay, on those 20 properties, or it might be 5 properties, it's usually a relatively small number, but on those properties that are really driving the performance and the value of your company, you need to be disclosing more. You need to be, at the front end, they want you to include descriptions of those properties, descriptions of major changes, descriptions of plans for major properties. There's a section on auditing, which talks a lot about auditors' definitions and procedures for auditing oil and gas reserves. So there are a number of different approaches for meeting NI 51101 and SEC guidelines for independent disclosure, disclosure of oil and gas reserves information, and independence as well. So in Canada, there's 3 or 4 different ways that companies go about actually getting evaluations done on an annual basis. The simplest is an independent evaluator will evaluate 100% of the assets. Pretty much all private companies that use independent evaluators do that. Most public companies do. The largest public companies generally don't. And so the other options are you can do the evaluations internally. You can have your own people evaluate your assets and then have them audited by an independent qualified auditor. You can also do evaluations on a rotating period. So some of the largest companies don't evaluate 100% of their reserves every year. They'll have an independent evaluator do a third of their properties on a 3-year rotation. And there are companies, there's a wide variance of what companies want in an audit. So COGEH is much less specific when it comes to audits than it is with evaluations. So audits can be as high level as looking at the procedures and guidelines that the company has in place internally for evaluating oil and gas assets, looking at the qualifications of the evaluators and doing some spot checks on some of the properties to make sure it's in compliance, pretty much all the way up to essentially an evaluation of most of the assets. So again, there's a section in COGEH that talks specifically about what auditors should be looking for, what they should be doing, and what they need for qualifications to do so. Then the last thing in COGEH, pretty much all the volumes have glossaries and defined terms at the back. So this is 15, 20, 30 pages that really goes through all of the major terms that you see throughout COGEH, throughout PRMS, as well as conversion factors, BOE ratios, that kind of stuff. It's pretty, we actually include most of a few of the COGEH appendixes get included in all of Roll's reports because they're pretty quick and easy way to reference some good detailed material. So getting into volume 3, so that's pretty much through volume 1 and 2, and then there's just the last couple slides are really high level about what's in volume 3. So like we talked about coal bed methane reserves, there's probably 100 pages on how to evaluate CBM very specifically. Reserves recognition for international properties, so it talks a little bit about unique challenges for evaluating international assets in other jurisdictions. Commercial constraints, so that's talking about PSCs, that's talking about contracts. Contracts in Canada are usually quite different from what you would see internationally, so there's a specific section in here that talks about common practices in most of the rest of the world for oil and gas contracts. And fiscal regimes, so dealing with other royalty structures. COGEH is pretty specific to Canadian and really Albertan fiscal regimes, although I'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow, but COGEH is in the middle of being updated and they're actually making it much less Canada specific. And then the third part is detailed guidelines for estimation and classification of bitumen and SAGD, which we talked a little bit. So that's it for this presentation.